All right, folks, I am back. We'll see if this QuickTime records well. I noticed the last one I recorded didn't have any problems for this class, but in the other class, there was one of those classic 7-minute lulls in video. So once again, I recorded that right after, totally random. If it happens, I will just leave the slides up for longer until the video returns. So sorry, nothing I can do about it. And Apple is so busy, their support line, that I can't even get in touch with that. We are going to have another video live chat session tomorrow. Hopefully some more of you will join on to it. Should be a lot of fun. I'm recording this Wednesday morning, so I haven't had a chance to see most of your responses to the discussion board prompt about the similarities and differences between Vilasa and Hai. I think it was Colby, perhaps, who a lot of you said they were very similar in many ways, but some said you were different. Some said they were different. Somebody said, Hai really kind of set the scene, made you feel like you were there. And I think it was Colby who said, he said he felt like the Hai was writing about people, whereas Vilasa's writing about a people. That is a really good way of phrasing it. If that wasn't Colby, sorry to whoever wrote that, but kudos to you. Hai's in dialogue with exactly the same kind of theory that, I'm gonna put the fan on. It is super humid. Still at the ranch, but it's been raining and it's been super humid, and I've been outside, so my hair looks like crazy, so I'm wearing my hat. You'll probably see a lot of that for the rest of the semester since haircuts are no longer possible in COVID-19 time. So Vilasa very much is about presenting the Wari case as a kind of structural logic, as a system of meaning, and not only internal to the Wari, but as a variation on this broader Amazonian philosophy of humanity and of difference, and of what she said in the introduction, this idea that all indigenous American societies, and all through North America into the Arctic, are premised upon a sustained relationship with difference. They need difference in their lives, but also, of course, outside of their lives in order to reproduce themselves. And it's very different, what she says, according from a European logic of difference. Once again, to call all of Europe the same or the West the same, even though we constantly do that in this class, there's no way to get around it. It's problematic, but she's interested in these large philosophical systems. And there's nothing wrong with that. It produces some really amazing and brilliant work. Like I said, Vilasa is a top dog for an Amazonianist, just like Viveros de Castro, and it's no coincidence that they worked together and studied with each other, and I think teach at the same university. I'm co-editing a book on shamanism with Luis Costa, another one of these Brazilian, I call them neoclassicists or neostructuralists. Great friend, amazing ethnographer, but very much part of the Vilasa style of research. And I'll give you a clue. We haven't seen much of the analysis per se yet, but in this chapter, there's a good example of the way she kind of looks at Wari life as the instantiation or the manifestation or the demonstration of a symbolic logic, which is their culture, which is their philosophy of humanity and of difference and all of this stuff. Their idea of, that Amazonian peoples are fundamentally open to difference, that must have a tense relationship with difference, but difference is necessary for people to produce themselves. So that idea of she's more interested in a people as evidence of a philosophy, I think is really useful. Whereas, although Hai talks a lot about this theory, you get more a sense of just kind of real people negotiating everyday life. And that's much more of the kind of anthropology and ethnography that I do myself and I prefer, and I theoretically defend it. I think it's more empirically rich because not only, individuals exist, everyday actions exist, and all of that's available to me as an ethnographer. Other people mention kind of emotion, and you're not probably going to see much emotion in this book, which is true. What's really interesting is to read Strange Enemies alongside Beth Conklin's Consuming Grief, because there you have someone who's not involved in this symbolic economy of alterity style, although she knows it, she likes it, but it's all about emotion and grief as the way to explain, let's say, Wari cannibalism. And Vilasa has a very different interpretation. So if you read those two books together, it's fascinating. All right, so I'm going to jump into the lecture. Chapter 1, from Strange Enemies. As I said before, all of these PowerPoints are brand new to me. I'm rereading the book, taking new notes on it. This is why it's a high workload, but it's fresh in my head. So it's fun, and you only really know a book and learn it by teaching it, as I've said to you before. By the way, start working on your final papers. You don't have that much long to do them. And set up a Skype call with me if you want to talk about them. So I've entitled this lecture Modes of Wari Difference. So for your discussion board prompt, in Chapter 1 of Strange Enemies, Vilasa describes the logic of Wari kinship. For the Wari, real kin are those who have eaten together, fed each other, and slept close to each other physically, like in the same house, even maybe touching each other for a long time. Following that logic, Vilasa writes that one of her primary Wari collaborators, or her colleagues, as Craig would say, told her that she's his real daughter, not his figurative or metaphorical daughter. And she talks about him as my father. I think this is Paleto, who we hear about, the one real individual in this book, as far as I can tell. So he said, no, you're my family. You've been made my family. It didn't matter that, my DNA is not in you. My sperm didn't create you. You didn't come out of my wife's body. You are my real, true daughter. And it sounds like in some ways, in terms of how she writes, she respects that logic, although it's curious to see whether, how she talks about her relationship with Wari people outside of her ethnography and outside of an academic context. So in your discussion board posts, I want you to share your thoughts regarding the Wari logic of kinship and relatedness, this idea that it's, created through these acts of being close together, feeding each other, and especially sharing substances like food, like bodily fluids with each other, and actually becoming one body. We saw that same idea in the Waorani case with Casey High, the idea that by living together, people become one body and hence become true, real kin. So in your own society or our own society, what's our own logic of relatedness, of kinship? For us, is it really all about genetics and shared DNA, i.e. who your real parents and siblings are? We have these paternity tests. If as a man you're shown to have contributed your gametes to a fetus, and then that child is born, you are lawfully that child's parent, and you must pay, child support. And I think many people in our society think that, if you're of the same blood, literally the family, that's a metaphor for DNA, you look alike, you think alike. The idea of evolutionary theory is really important in our society. We think our genes can explain everything about us. Many people do. I'm a cultural anthropologist, so I don't. I think upbringing and culture is much more important. But it's a very powerful idea in our society. And I would say it's, let's say, the normative or mainstream idea. That's what real relatedness, real family, real kinship is. So what do you think about that idea? Or is that idea, is the Wari notion of kind of produced relatedness being real relatedness, is that actually close to how we feel and how we think? When we talk about people as our fathers or our uncles or our cousins and we're not related to them biologically, is that a metaphor or is that real? And if it is real, is it just real culturally? Or, as I said before, is it also the case legally too? For example, in cases regarding inheritance, in cases regarding parental rights, in cases regarding rights to visit family in hospital intensive care units. COVID-19, you can't visit people, but in order to get access to people in hospitals, you need to be married to or close kin to them. And this is why some issues like gay marriage are so important, because there's all these rights, with both final in-law relations, marriage relations, and consanguineal kin relations, blood relations that have legal consequences. So is our logic, the Western or whatever logic, similar to the Wari logic or different? Do they overlap? I want to hear your thoughts on that one. So first slide, Wari identity. Now, Wari is a first person plural pronoun that also means we, human being, and sometimes indigenous human being, right? As we learned with Viveros de Castro in like the second or third week. Most Amazonian ethnonyms, names for ethnic groups, actually mean we or us or human being in general. And that's definitely the case for the Wari The Wadi idea of the other, the true other, is the enemy, and that's Wijam, a word I have on a subsequent slide, and we'll talk more about that in the next chapter. But the idea of the Wari as like a unified tribe or ethnic group is something that only came very recently to them after, their integration with outsiders, and it's still not a very powerful idea to them. And I see the same thing with Kofan people. There's a lot more sense of which, let's say, river or dialect group you identify with, which village you identify with. This idea of the whole ethnic group, the nation, as something really essential to you. For many indigenous peoples, that's a fairly recent thing because there were very few situations in which a whole ethnic group acted in concert with each other. Maybe when the Kofan, 4 centuries ago or 5 centuries ago, between 4 and 5, were fighting the Spanish. Maybe they unified as an entire ethnic group. When they were fighting the Inca before that, maybe they unified as an entire ethnic group and really felt like we are the Kofan. Although the Kofan, the word, didn't exist that time. It was Ai, human being, just like Wari. They used to think of themselves, and they still think of themselves, Wari people, as a collection of separate tatirim, who are named, spatially associated subgroups that identify as foreigners to one another. 2 points here. My pronunciation of these words is, usually I just pronounce them as if they were written in Spanish, use Spanish pronunciation. My Portuguese is non-existent. And I had a really interesting conversation yesterday with Kristen from this class, who's really into linguistics and phonetics and orthography about the correct way to pronounce things. So we can turn to her, who actually goes through the orthographic notes, the spelling notes, to get us the real pronunciations of some of these terms. If she'll do it, maybe she'll record a video response or something that we can all watch. You don't have to do that, Kristen, but it'd be fun. So, we think of the foreigner as the other, truly different from us, right? But for the Wari, a foreigner is also a Wari person who does not live in your group and often maintains affinal or marrying relationships with you. And for the Wari, traditionally, there wasn't war between foreigners. There was only war between enemies. Dog, shut up. So an individual usually identifies for life with the subgroup, the tatirim of their mother or father, but there's some flexibility, right? Descent is traced through both lines, and sometimes you go to some other village, you want to marry someone, and if they turn to be from the same subgroup as you, you're not supposed to marry them because it's a little bit too close. But then you're like, well, but my mother was a different subgroup, so maybe that's my subgroup. People play with these rules pragmatically to get things done. So Vilasa says that a foreigner for the Wari is no longer like a paradigmatic kinsperson or family member who resides with you, but is instead another Wari person who mainly interacts with you through a cycle of ritual parties and festivities. I'll talk about at the end of today, but I won't go into detail on that. And also somebody you're supposed to marry, and I'll talk about that, I think, on the next slide. Oh, no, 2 slides ahead. So Wari identity and Wari living. We get some basic ethnographic information here on the Wadi. These are people who mainly live on upland forests not along the main riversides as many Amazonian people do, but along small streams in the interior, close to the mountains, actually. So very isolated areas. Vilasa says there may be historical reasons for them getting pushed out, but she also thinks there's a cultural reason. They associate large bodies of water and large rivers not only with the enemies who've come into their territory, but also with the dead. And we see this in some of their rituals. Their main crop is maize or corn, which they eat directly in various forms, in which they also turn into certain beverages, both alcoholic and non-alcoholic. Something Beth Conklin stresses in her account of the Wari is these people seem to be really isolated, right? They don't have canoes. They don't have hallucinogenic drugs. Their culture seems very, quote unquote, simple in many ways. They use stone axes until very recently. So even by Amazonian standards, they seem like a really isolated people, perhaps in some ways even more so than the Waorani. So corn is the most important thing for them. To eat corn is to be a true Wari or a true human being. And they define people in many ways by what they eat, right? The logic of predation, what you eat is very important to the Wari. But before, they don't have corn all year long. They have it, I think, Vilasa says, maybe for 9 months of the year. So for those 3 extra months when they don't have access to corn, when it hasn't matured yet, they're away from their villages, away from their gardens, their corn gardens, and they're living purely by hunting and gathering. So these are people who can live as foragers, and they do for much of the year, even though they're truly hunter horticulturalists or hunter gardeners, not hunter gatherers. Traditionally, residential groups, i.e. villages, consisted of between 10 and 50 individuals who lived in separate family houses, but there was also a men's house in the village, the same thing we saw with the Kaya Po. Remember them from way back when? So these local groups, these residential groups, typically formed around a group of married siblings, and newly married couples could move either into the household of the wife's parents or the husband's parents. They're neither truly a matrilocal or exoralocal people or a patrilocal or virilocal people. It's up to all sorts of reasons why you would move to one or the other, just like the Kofun. There's no strong rules about that. In the men's house, that's where men kind of hung out, just like the Kayapo. They talk informally there. Bachelors, unmarried, kind of relatively mature young men sleep there. When you get married, you move into a parents-in-law's house. When people come for a festival from another local group, they sleep there. And it's also the area where killers, those who've killed, seclude themselves during their ritual period. And then they emerge after that from the men's house. They don't sleep in their own homes with their families, with their wives. They sleep in the men's house. Just recently, villages have become much more stable units for the Wari. FUNAI, the National Indian Service, the government social service agency for Indians in Brazil, right? They say Indian in Brazil, Indio. They've created these posts, these administrative posts in Wari villages, and now villages are really kind of cemented around them, and they attained a much more stable identity as villages. Before, they were much more loosely associated with garden sites. In fact, people would name areas or residential sites by the gardens that were there because corn is so important to them rather than like a site where you have your houses. So residential patterns have changed quite a bit. Now some more into kinship. So Wari consanguinity, right? Consanguinity, consangre, relations of blood, relations of descent, siblings, parents, that kind of stuff for us. Although for them, slightly more. So something I always tell my intro to cultural anthropology students about, and Beth Conklin talks about, and many people have looked at it, both among the Wari and other indigenous groups, mainly in Amazonia, but it's an idea that exists in other parts of the world. They believe in multiple biological paternity, i.e., multiple men can be biological parents or, real parents of the same child. And the practice that goes along with that is often when women are pregnant, they sleep with more than one man. And it's the semen these men give to the fetus that allows it to grow, to develop into a strong child. There's been some research done with the Bari people, not the Wadi. This is a different group living in a different area of Amazonia, that a child who has more than one father, identified father, tends to survive better than one with only one father because you have more men trying to take care of you because you're a relative to them. For the Wari, Vilasa tells us, even though multiple men's contribution to a fetus are recognized, only one man is typically noted as the real father of the child, the primary father. And I do like this book in many ways because Vilasa doesn't make it seem too neat, too structured, right? You just say, okay, so men give the semen to form the bones of the child, and women give the blood to form, let's say, the flesh of the child. Something she's heard, and then she says, I asked all these people, and they're really unclear about the mother and her blood and how it forms the fetus. Some says it does, some say it does, and some say it doesn't. So who knows? Something some people think, but not everybody thinks. It's good to be certain in your ethnography about what people are uncertain about. Just like us, we have different ideas about all this stuff. The Wari are the same. They're a much smaller ethnic group, but there's a diversity of knowledge and opinions within that group. Why not let your reader know that as an ethnographer? To me, it makes the ethnography more trustworthy. As we started out talking about with this chapter, the main means of creating true blood relations isn't just giving birth to people, but it's through sharing substances via feeding, eating together, sleeping near each other, holding each other, having sex with each other. That's, leads to the strange idea that spouses are not actually in-laws or marriage relatives. Eventually they become marriages by blood because they have one body. A notion, we see actually in some Christianity or Western logics too, right? The shared body of the husband and wife. But for the Wari, extends beyond the spouses to include everybody who has those kinds of relationships with each other. And those kinds of relations created by those practices, sharing bodily substances, same thing the Waorani believe, it's much, much, much more important for Wari people than something like biological or genetic parentage. Even though now I think a lot of Wari people know about that logic, young Wari kids are probably in school and learning about procreation. For them, it's still not nearly as important as what true, real kinship is. And that's something you build up slowly over time by being close and holding each other, feeding each other, sharing substances. That's what family means. That's what relatedness means. This other stuff, no, it's kind of insignificant. Interesting idea. So as I said a second ago, even in marrying foreigners, right, Tatzirim eventually become not affinal kin to people in a village, but consanguineal kin to them because they share those substances with them. And there's this drive, like we saw with the Waorani, when people move in, people share things with them, share substances with them, but then also very quickly start referring to them not with affinal kin terms, which they do have in-law terms like mother-in-law, father-in-law, brother-in-law, but through kin terms like mother, father, brother, sister. And it's something I see in Kofan society too. There are some affinal terms, but pretty quickly the consanguineal terms are emphasized when somebody starts living with you to show how closely related they are to you. And a person who was once an affine eventually becomes a consanguine, although never quite fully, as we'll talk about with the next slide. So Wari affinity, Wari relations by marriage, in-law relations. It's a weird tension for them and a contradiction. They don't, according to Vilasa, like to marry foreigners, i.e. Wari people from other subgroups, but they do. You can't marry consanguineal kin because that would be incest, and most people in your local group are related to you by blood, consanguineally. But marriages between subgroups, marriages with foreigners, also cement relationships between those groups that are really important. Those relations allow people to remain foreigners, i.e. Wari, rather than to be totally cut off and become Wijam, or enemies to you. And those are the people you really fight and you really kill. So by marrying between groups and having festivals between, these kind of groups, they remain part of your society. And those relationships are essential for Wari society to exist. But because of those in-marrying foreigners always retain a kind of hint of threatening difference, I think Vilasa calls it like incorporated alterity. It's alterity, but alterity within the group, right? Affinity. Foreigners who move into a local group are often named as the source of conflicts within the village. Kofan have a similar idea, but it's when you move into a Kofan village, you don't just become related, you become A'i, you become a Kofan. But as soon as you do something violent or disruptive, people remember your genealogy. Oh, his grandfather was this kind of person, or this kind of person, non-Kofan person, i.e. they're A'i Vedam Bichwa, someone who has not become a human being, someone who's not become a Kofan. The Wari have a similar notion. So as soon as some disruptive practice, violence or adultery, something like that occurs, it usually people blame the foreigner, and then you have this ritual fight that often breaks out using poles or clubs. People get together and smack each other around, usually men. They make each other bleed. The point is never to kill, though, just to hurt. Wari people almost always never kill each other. But you do see sometimes when someone dies and they can't explain it, someone gets sick. Sorcery is sometimes identified as the cause. My sense is not as much as you saw for the Waorani case, either by Waorani shamans or Quechua shamans. But for the Wari, sorcery, they do believe in sorcery. We don't know that much about their shamanistic practices. We'll hear a little bit more. I know some from Conklin's book. So it is this idea that the person most likely to be violent towards you is not the person who's most like you, but who's different from you. And that either is a foreigner and an enemy. An enemy is physical violence. A foreigner is supernatural, shamanic violence. Physical violence between Wari people, both within groups and with other groups, with subgroups, between subgroups or foreigners, it's almost unheard of. Although Vilasa has mentioned a case in which it existed. But that foreigner group, actually, the people who were killed from that, who were Wari, were like taken to be enemies for a set of reasons and treated as enemies and actually consumed in a cannibalistic act to show they were not wari, they were wijan, they were not human being, they were enemies, they were prey. So in general, foreigners and the affinity, the relation of affinity they represent, kind of means dangerous difference, but difference that's necessary for Wari society to continue to exist. This goes back to the basic idea of Vilasa and Viveros de Castro and many other Amazonianists, that difference needs to exist for these societies to maintain and reproduce themselves. Viveros de Castro has an interesting idea. Like, the real affine is what he calls the potential affine, because as soon as you marry somebody, they start becoming your consanguineal kin. So the true in-law to you is somebody you haven't even married yet, the potential person to marry. That's where you truly find this relation of the in-law, which is difficult for us because there's a whole bunch of people we could marry, and we're not going to call them in-laws because we haven't married them yet. But for Amazonian people, according to Viveros de Castro, it's only the people you haven't married yet that you truly treat as an in-law, because as soon as, spouses get married and start, living together, they become consanguineal kin. Interesting idea. Last slide, Wari festivals. There's a lot. Vilasa has written a lot about Wari festivals. I'm not going to describe them each in detail. She gives a nice summary here. They have 3 of them. Don't know about my pronunciation. The Tamara, the Ururoin, and the Huitop. And these are intergroup festivals, not something that's celebrated just within a village or residential group, but between residential groups and even between subgroups. So these festivals involve tense relations between the hosts, the people who are inviting the others, and the guests, those who come from another village or subgroup. The latter of whom, the guests, are classified as animalistic, or animals that must be mocked and punished through excessive drinking of alcohol by the hosts. These are kind of tense. They're fun, they're exciting, but they feel a bit tense and dangerous too, right? But they're very important to Wari people. Sometimes the guests are from the same subgroup, but sometimes they're true foreigners. But always the difference of the guests is highlighted, even if they're from the same subgroup, the same tatirim as the people who live in the village. And these festivals involve really elaborate multi-day dancing rituals, singing, a lot of mocking of each other, joking, but tense joking, sexual innuendo and sexual tension. There's some gender dimensions to these rituals. Giving and receiving food and drink, especially, from the hosts to the guests. And exchanging everyday goods almost always before they leave. The guests say, hey, could we have, some of these arrows, some of these blah, 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 blah. This makes me think about something. It's something we call symbolic. Well, I guess you would call it symbolic exchange. It's this idea that in many societies, including in Amazonia, you have these weird feasts, and at the end, people exchange with each other, and they claim to have forgotten how to make things that they clearly still make and know how to make. Some guy will say, oh, you visitor, you've got these arrows. Man, I don't know how to make arrows anymore. I really need some. Can you give some to me? And I'll give you, a pot. And then the visitor will say, oh, it's great. I don't know how to make pots anymore. They know how to do this. The point is, they don't need these objects. It's the idea that by exchanging goods, you create social relations and maintain a kind of stability there. It's not about the object, it's about the relation. And the same thing kind of happens during these festivities for the Wari. So the central theme in all these festivities, these festivals, these ritual festivals, of course, for Vilasa, is predation. The hosts are the predators and the visitors are the prey. And these things cycle. So you're a predator when the people come to your village. When you go to their village, you're the prey and they're the predator, right? Cycles around. There's a balance here. So the ritual enactment of predation, of themes and acts of predation in these festivals stresses the difference, understood as affinity, right? Actual or potential in-law relations between the guests and the hosts. In one festival, I forget which one it is, the hosts get the guests so drunk that they symbolically kill them, and then they have to revive them with warm water. Beth Conklin writes a lot more about this. And the guests drink so much that the hosts just basically pour alcoholic corn beer down their throats that they vomit spit out the drink, they drink again, vomit, pass out, yada, yada, yada. And this was the example I was going to give you of kind of the symbolic analysis that Vilasa does throughout this book. She says, okay, so what's this about? This excessive drinking and then vomiting. And, many of us maybe have done that before, but she says, oh, clearly this is anti-eating. Symbolically, you're giving people so much to eat that they have to spit it or vomit it back up so it never becomes part of their system. So it's like the opposite of eating or feeding. And because the guests never feed then or never eat, they are true prey, making the host true predators, i.e. those with the food, those who eat, the guests who, because they vomit, don't eat, are more like prey. Did a Wari person ever tell her that? No. Is that an interesting interpretation? Yes. Is it a symbolic analysis of this ritual that might be true or false? Maybe. But Vilasa does a lot of that kind of symbolic analysis when she's looking at everyday life, when she's looking at rituals, when she's looking at myths. And it's always her interpretation. And she creates this beautiful philosophical puzzle where all the pieces fit together, but it all depends on her interpretation and not, say, like the interpretation of Wari people. That's what a structuralist or a neo-structuralist, a la Vilasa or Viveros de Castro or Levi-Strauss do. So it's all about this kind of abstract symbolic analysis. Fascinating stuff. Do I always really trust it? Do I know that vomiting by guests means the absence of eating, means these people are prey rather than predators? Once again, interesting interpretation. Are we certain this is true? No. But is it beautiful? Does it make sense? Sure. So let's follow Vilasa along for this ride and see how she does some of this symbolic analysis, which you didn't see Casey Hyde doing much of, through the rest of her book, and try to understand this as a really good example of a certain kind of Amazonianist anthropology. So that's it for today, folks. We'll see what the freezing was like. All right. Bye-bye.